Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Anna Ratuski, and I'm a PhD student at the University of British Columbia in the Animal Welfare Program. And today I'm going to be talking about one of our projects where we gave Playpen access to standard house laboratory mice. In a Canadian research facility, this is what a standard mouse cage looks like. It is also referred to sometimes as a shoebox cage because it's roughly the size of a shoebox, and typically it would contain bedding, nesting material, and a hut. Unfortunately, shoebox cages do not accommodate a full range of mouse behavior, and this would include things like burrowing, climbing, foraging, exploration, and more dynamic social relationships. There's increasing evidence that standard cages have negative impacts on mouse welfare. For example, when compared to mice that are provided with more extensive enrichment, standard house mice show higher rates of morbidity, increased stereotypic behavior, and increased behaviors indicative of anxiety or depression. And this is even when the standard cage mice are provided with things like nesting material. So there's evidence that more complex environments are better for welfare. But providing more complexity in the environment can be tricky when enrichment programs often face practical barriers, such as a lack of space or lack of funding. So we propose that providing animals with temporary access to a more extensive enrichment, which we call playpens, is a viable solution. So on the right here, this is an example of one of the playpens that we've used with our rats in the past, where they would go and do their training or testing for the day, and then they would get to come and spend some time in the playpen to get some exercise through digging, climbing, running around, and playing with each other. Other countries have also implemented this in their facilities, and my colleague Joanna Mikowska has done some research on playpens for rats. So we do suggest that this is a viable interim enrichment solution for rats in research facilities. But this got us thinking, what about mice? We use more mice in research, and they look similar to rats, but they are behaviorally different. So we wanted to look at this more closely to see if this would be a viable option for them as well. So our first research question was, is playpen access a rewarding experience for mice? We aimed to assess how quickly mice were willing to enter playpens and how much anticipation the mice showed before playpen access. We predicted that mice would voluntarily enter playpens more quickly over time, and that mice would show increased anticipation prior to playpen access. Our second research question was, what does mouse behavior look like during playpen access? We aimed to assess how mice were interacting with provided items and how active mice were during playpen sessions. And this is important because enrichment strategies vary between studies or between facilities, but effective enrichment should be used by animals to allow for a wider range of behaviors. So we wanted to pay attention to this fact and document how mice were engaging with the provided space. We predicted that mice would show more diverse and active behaviors when they were in playpens. For this study, we used 14 cages of female mice housed in mixed strain trios. So we used DBA, BALB, and C57 mice, so they're gray, white, and black. These are commonly used strains of laboratory mice. They're also commonly used as the background strain for breeding different genetic strains. And it makes it so that we can identify individuals quickly and easily just using their coat colors. It also gives us the ability to look at the different effects that genetics might play in how they respond to enrichment. All of the mice were housed in standard cages, so that's what you see on the right here, with bedding, nesting material, and a hut. 7 of the cages were in the playpen treatment, and so they were given 30 minutes of playpen access 3 times per week. And so we made our playpens out of rat cages that existed in our facility. So these are the OptiRat Plus cages from Animal Care Systems. We took out 2 of the filters and connected them with a tunnel. So you can see on the left, the darker one is filled with a burrowing substrate. So we used soil or coconut fiber for this. And then we wanted to have another cage that had a bunch of different things for mice to engage with. So this cage contained bedding, nesting material, things for mice to hide in or climb on. It had a running wheel. It had netting for mice to climb up onto. And so lots of different things for mice to engage with in this environment. To get mice in and out of the playpens, we used these colorful tunnels that they were habituated to before the study started, and we timed how long it took from when the tunnel was made available to them to when they entered the playpens. And this latency can be used as an indicator of how rewarding something is to an animal, with the notion that animals are motivated to approach things they perceive as positive and avoid things they perceive as negative. This also allowed us to avoid any aversive handling interactions with our mice because we wanted this to be a stress-free experience for them and give them some agency to go when they wanted to go. With that said, we did have a time limit, so if the mice did not go within 5 minutes, we would gently handle them using their overturned hut from their cage to transport them from one place to another, but we rarely had to do this. Over time, mice entered playpens more quickly. And as you can see in the plot here, on day 1, there's a lot more variation between individuals and also some variation between strains. So the bulb mice, the green dots, you can see were among the slower mice on day 1 and after day 1. So they showed more hesitancy and took a longer time to sort of get used to what was going on and show motivation to go quicker into the playpens. Whereas the C57 mice, the blue dots, were quite quick from the get-go, and by day 3, we're going in roughly a minute or less. And by day 12 and 14, the mice are basically running to get into the playpens, taking an average of around 15 seconds. So this is our first indicator that mice are motivated to go to this location, and it's a positive experience for them. Our second measure was anticipatory behavior. So this can be used to infer how rewarding something is to an animal. And I want to give the example of you're taking your dog for a walk and you give them a cue, which is you go and you get the leash off the wall, and this indicates to your dog that they're about to go for a walk. And in the time it takes between you grabbing that leash and you getting ready to go, your dog might show a lot of different behaviors indicating their anticipation for going for a walk. So they might be running around, barking, waiting by the door, wagging their tail, and just showing general anticipation for this outcome because you indicated that it was going to happen. We essentially did the same thing with our mice. So we gave them a conditioned cue. We waited a set amount of time. So for us, it was 1 minute. And then the playpen mice would get to go into the playpens. And the control mice were given the same cue and waited the same amount of time, but they were not given playpen access. Their cage would just go back onto the cage rack. And I'll show you what this looks like in practice. So you'll see a finger dragging across the cage lid. And this is the cue to the mice that the waiting period is about to start. And then we wait 1 minute and record this behavior. And you'll see that the playpen mice are showing a much higher level of activity here. So running back and forth, standing on top of the hut, rearing, sniffing, just generally moving quite a bit, whereas the control mice are still just sort of emerging from their nest, looking a lot more cautious, moving a lot more slowly. And so we'd watch this and score every single behavior that the mice do. And every time they switch from doing one behavior to another, that counts as one behavioral transition. And we'd take that total frequency of behavioral transitions and use that as their level of anticipatory behavior. So we measured this on day 1 before the mice had ever been given playpen access. So the cue to all the mice was neutral. And then we compared that with their behavior on days 8 to 14. So once they'd had some time to build up an association between that cue and going to the playpens. And we calculated their change in anticipatory behavior. And so on the y-axis here, we see the mean amount of behavioral transitions they're doing as the measure of anticipatory behavior. And this is showing how much it increased from day 1. So for all the playpen mice, you can see that it did increase. So those are the dark blue bars. And for the control mice, they did not show much of an increase, which makes sense because they would get the cue, wait a minute, and then just go back on the cage rack. So as expected, playpen mice showed increased anticipatory behavior prior to playpen access. And this is another indicator to us that this was a rewarding experience to them. I want to show just some examples of what behavior looked like when mice were in the playpens. They're quite active, engaging with a lot of different things, moving quickly, sniffing, running in the wheel, getting lots of physical activity. And then this is an example of mice engaging in the burrowing side of the cage, which is super cute, fun to watch, and a super popular behavior among the mice. This was one of the most popular activities for mice to do while they are in these environments, and this might indicate that burrowing is a particularly important behavioral opportunity for mice. And it's one that they're not often given in laboratory environments. So when we looked at their behavior during playpen sessions, we found that playpen mice performed significantly more ambulatory behaviors than control mice while we were observing them. And when I say ambulatory behaviors, I mean activities where mice are on their feet and moving. So we saw that mice were really motivated to burrow and explore. And this is shown by these high frequencies of these activities. So digging, walking, running, climbing, and wheel running. Overall, mice show motivation to burrow and explore, and they also showed motivation to use both sides of the playpen. So they were located in the burrowing cage and the object cage roughly equally during observation. So this might indicate that having lots of different opportunities for behaviors is important. Looking at non-ambulatory behaviors, control mice showed significantly more non-ambulatory behavior than playpen mice. These behaviors were rarely observed in the mice that were in the playpens. So it does make sense for the control mice to be spending a lot of their time resting, grooming, and sitting in the shelter because we did observe this during the daytime. However, we also observed the playpen mice during the daytime, and they were quite active and not choosing to spend their time resting. So from this, we can conclude that mice find playpens rewarding and display a range of natural behaviors when they're in the playpens. Experiences with enrichment might vary depending on genetic strain. We did see some strain differences in our outcomes. Mice might also benefit in other ways when given access to a playpen, and so we're interested in looking at broader impacts on animal welfare here. But overall, playpens are an immediate option to increase access to environmental enrichment for laboratory mice, and this is something that should be pursued. I want to end off with some next steps, starting with the fact that there is more than one way to make a playpen. This is how we've done it. It was our first time doing it. We tried to choose things that are practical to implement. So we used rat cages that were available in our facility. Technically, these were individually ventilated cages, but we did keep them off the rack because we had connected them with that tunnel, so they didn't fit on the rack in that way. But you could technically, if this is something you're concerned about, you could technically do this with an IVC rat cage. Other practical recommendations I'd make is that coconut fiber tends to be better than soil as a burrowing substrate because it's easier to sterilize and maintain. However, the way that you make your playpen might be different depending on what you have available to you and your circumstances. But I would say the most important thing is that it's relevant and engaging for the mice, and it provides them with a wide variety of behavioral opportunities. Next, we're looking at how playpens influenced aggression and stereotypic behavior in the home cage. So this analysis is underway right now. And in the future, we're interested in looking at if playpens are effective enrichment for male laboratory mice. We did do a short pilot study with males and females and had some promising results from that, but we want to look at this more systematically because it does look like the males have more complex social interactions when they're in the playpen environments. We are also interested in looking at whether welfare is negatively impacted if playpen access is given too infrequently or if it's discontinued, in which case that would not be a good enrichment strategy. Thank you for listening. I want to thank our UBC animal care technicians, as well as my collaborators and all of the mice that made this research possible. And my email is there if you want to reach out and chat about anything related to enrichment or playpens. I'd be happy to hear from you. Thanks.